Hello and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 428th New Social Environment. I am Nick Bennett, the Special Projects Editor here at the Rail, and I have the pleasure and privilege of being your MC today for a conversation on Jasper Johns' Mind Mirror with Carlos Basualdo, Scott Rothkopf, and Richard Shiff. We're thrilled to have the poet Cole Swensen here, who will read to close today's program. A few notes before we get started. Here at the Rail, we're celebrating our 21st anniversary by working on our first ever endowment campaign. This initiative will ensure the print edition of the Rail and our public programming, celebrating cross-pollination in the arts, humanities, and sciences, all remains free and accessible for generations to come. Please check the chat for more information and links, which we will be sharing in just one moment. The Rail also acknowledges that Black Lives Matter and that here in New York, we are on Lenape-Hoking, the unceded land and waters of the Wappinger, Canarsie, Munsee, and Lenni Lenape people of the Delaware Nation and Shinnecock Indian Nation. We encourage you to check the chat for a living document of resources and actions, which will also be posted in just a moment. But now to introduce today's guests and host. Curator Carlos Basualdo is the Keith L. and Catherine Sachs Senior Curator of Contemporary Art at the Philadelphia Museum of Art. Among the exhibitions that he has organized at the museum include Bruce Nauman, Topological Gardens, which represented the United States at the 2009 Venice Biennale, a survey exhibition of Michelangelo Pistoletto in 2010, which was a collaboration between the Philadelphia Museum of Art and MAXI, among many others. We'll post a full bio for everyone today in the chat, but our next guest is Senior Deputy Director and Nancy and Steve Crown Family Chief Curator at the Whitney Museum of American Art, Scott Rothkopf, served on the curatorial team responsible for the Whitney's inaugural collection display, America is Hard to See. Rothkopf served as Senior Editor of Artforum International from 2004 through 2009, where he was a frequent contributor of feature reviews and essays. And last but certainly not least, our host today, the Effie Marie Kane Regents Chair in Art at the University of Texas at Austin. Richard Shiff directs the Center for the Study of Modernism. His scholarly interests range broadly across the field of modern and contemporary art and theater, with publications including Cézanne and the End of Impressionism, Barnett Newman, A Catalogue Raisonné, Between Sense and de Kooning, Ellsworth Kelly, New York Drawings, and Sensuous Thoughts, Essays on the Work of Donald Judd. He is a consulting editor here at the Brooklyn Rail. And without further ado, Richard, passing the mic over to you.
Okay, thank you. I have to say that I have not yet gotten to the Philadelphia part of the show, but I feel acquainted with it through some very nice and intriguing installation shots. And I got to the New York part of the show just 2 days ago. So I'm new to this exhibition, this two-part exhibition. And obviously it must have been quite a curatorial challenge. It would be a curatorial challenge enough in one institution, but the work had to be divided between two. And I thought I would start with a very general question about curatorial practice, which is touched often in my mind by a statement that I came across that Jasper Johns made in 2005. And here's what he said. Most of us have an underlying sense of helplessness, a necessity to make what we call our work. Many have the odd sensation of being called upon to do it. And my question with regard to curatorial practice for both Scott and Carlos is, to what extent did the work, Jasper's work, determine your choices? How much is a curatorial vision? How much is Johns's vision? And how much is something that is not quite either of those two things, but the art pulling on you to do what you did?
Thanks, Richard. Do you want to start, Carlos?
Sure. The first thing, Richard, is that we were so lucky and we're so grateful to the amazing scholars that have produced the catalog raisonnées of painting and sculpture, Roberta Bernstein, Kate Gans with her catalog raisonné of prints. Because when we started working on the shows, those resources were available. And the fact that those resources were available, and Jasper has this incredible 70-year career, allow you to see a certain landscape. And once you see that landscape in its totality, you can create a sort of topological map of it. You can say, well, that's a hill, that's a valley, that's a river. And so what we intended to do was just to simply to lay out that landscape that we were so grateful to have been provided by these scholars. Certainly, as we see it from the perspective of today, the landscape is very stable and seems very present and seems that it's always been there. But we also acknowledge that that was at times simply a matter of illusion, because this was something that happened in time. So we started with those prerogatives, with that great possibility of looking at that landscape, with the understanding that what we look now as a fait accompli was developed through time, and simply was a matter of mapping it out in the best possible way. And to do that, we did not have to divide. We didn't really apply division into this equation. We applied multiplication instead. So we didn't have to really decide which works were going to go, in the Whitney or Philadelphia as a matter of division. We simply felt that we could unfold the vision of the landscape within the parameters of two institutions. And it was a lot of fun.
Yeah, I agree with everything Carlos said. And maybe if I could just add to that, Richard, thinking about your question, like, does the show come from the curators more or from the work or some combination thereof? And in my mind, it was kind of three parts. There was this surveying of the landscape of all of Jasper's work, which of course is, more than 1,000 or even 2,000 things. If you think of all the prints, all the drawings, all the paintings. And from those works, we arrived at essentially 10 ideas or concepts that we wanted to explore, these turns of mind, these ways into Jasper's work, his process, his themes, each of which would be articulated with 2 galleries, one in each city. And so at that point, in a way, really the curatorial vision did guide the selection of the work. We never started out with saying, these are our 500 favorite or the 500 best works of Jasper Johns, which might have actually resulted in a somewhat different checklist. In fact, I think if we had started with a preconceived idea of whatever Jasper's quote unquote masterpieces were, it wouldn't have been this show. I mean, some of those are in the show and others are not in the show, not because people didn't lend them, because we didn't ask for them. What we did was to look for the works that would, in a way, tell the story of those 20 galleries that we were writing. So at that point, the works kind of came in response to the curatorial conception that we had arrived at, but those themes or categories had drawn from the work to begin with, if that makes sense. So there was a kind of cycle of looking at the landscape of work, creating our 20 ideas, and then the works that could best tell those stories being the ones we marshaled for the show.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me in terms of his way of thinking. It seems in harmony with John's observe. And I also, certainly agree that he's somebody who throughout his career has been very careful about documentation. And then he's got great people that he's worked with on the scholarly end who have organized all of the documentation that he himself has kept. And I wonder, along those lines, whether how much of a hand did he have in perhaps adjusting language or checking facts, because I know that he likes, with regard to scholarly work, he likes to review it, not for the sake of changing an argument or an interpretation, but for the sake of making the factual account as accurate as possible.
You know, he did do that, Richard, when he reviewed certainly the catalog and the wall text, but I would say it was with a very light touch. There were quite very few specific comments that he made on each text or questions that were raised. And, you know, in a way, I mean, Carlos has heard me say this before, so I hate to bore him with a previous expression, but it was interesting for me, especially as someone who's worked with a lot of living artists who are much more involved in that curatorial dialogue with you know, the artist and the curator. He observed a real separation of church and state to the extent that he thought, you know, I make the work and the curator's job is to make the show. And he was a great abiding presence and support through the entire process. We would see him every few months to share our ideas, to ask him questions, to look at what he was making that was new in the studio. And some of those things ended up in our exhibition. And he was the single largest lender to the exhibition. So on the one hand, he was very involved in that sense. But on the other hand, he really gave us total freedom and trust to do what we wanted with his, to create these categories. As we saw, there were a couple of occasions where he might have suggested a specific work, a couple of occasions where he might have made a query about something that had been written. But by and large, it was a kind of relationship of, I think, real mutual trust and respect, and to some degree, curiosity. I think he seemed curious to understand what this next generation of curators might do with his work, and not certainly not heavy-handed in his replies to whatever our conjectures might have been.
Yeah, Carlos, do you want to?
No, I don't have much to add. I think Scott said it all. I mean, truly, and summarized it perfectly well. You know, to us, it felt when we explained how the process worked, he said, oh my God, it just sounds so complicated. Good luck. I hope you can pull it off. And he was very supportive with loans, extremely supportive, you know, with his own loans, and helping us navigate the troubled waters of asking for some of these wonderful objects.
Yeah, I think he is a remarkably curious man. You know, curious as to what people will say, and open to odd interpretations. So that's consistent with what you both seem to have experienced. You know, with regard to his wanting to see what you would come up with as a show. What I found really wonderful about the show, something that you've alluded to, is the combination of all the media, and also the large and the small, and the very small as well. But I wonder, you know, when you get to including the smallish things, in terms of some smaller drawings and some smaller paintings, you've got an awful lot to choose from to make a point or pick up on a point of curiosity. Was that in any way overwhelming? I mean, the amount of works on paper that Jasper has produced, or print work, and then print work which is modified and becomes singular, that sort of thing. I mean, he'll take a run of his own prints and modify each one by hand so that each is different.
Yes, I think that's a very good point, Richard. You know, and maybe we can, you know, dwell with that a little bit longer. I mean, usually when an artist makes a print, there's a number of intermediate steps. And, you know, very often those intermediate steps are not archived in any way. I mean, the master printer makes very detailed notes reproducing the process, so it can be done again, right? But in the case of Jasper, and from very early on, he has actually kept those so-called intermediate steps. And not only kept them, but he has signed those prints. So the status is really interesting. And Scott and I did some very early visits to the major repository to those archival prints, which is the National Gallery. They have, more, like I think there's 1,700 archival prints that include working proofs where he has made additions, so trial proofs that are simply, done so he could basically see what is it that he's working with. And it was for us a revelation, and we visited that independently. Scott spent a couple of days, sent me like so many pictures. Then I visited later, and we saw things that we were not familiar with. A way, a complete experimental spirit, open, playful, so much joy in trying so many different possibilities. And I think that was a deep inspiration for us, not only in terms of including that material, but in terms of the entirety of the show.
Yeah, and I would say I agree with that especially about the prints and how we approach them. And to your question too, Richard, about the drawings and being overwhelmed, there was some quality of that. But I remember going down before the catalog raisonné was published of the drawings to the Menil when they were opening the Drawings Institute, and that's where the book was being edited. And Joseph Newland showing me the page proofs, and I was overwhelmed. There were so many incredible, beautiful, and previously unpublished and unexhibited works. And I remember Carlos and I went to see Jasper, and we asked him something like, Jasper, how come you didn't tell us about any of these things? And he said, well, you didn't ask. And I just wanted to say, well, how could we ask about something we didn't know if we didn't know it existed? To which I think he said something like, well, that's a good point. So there was this incredible kind of undiscovered country of drawings for us to explore. And a little bit like I said in the first comment about, I don't know if it's the chicken or the egg, the artist or the curator, I remember thinking, and I can picture a couple of galleries at the Whitney, for example, in the Final Elegies Gallery, where there are trios of drawings. And I don't think that any of the 6 drawings I'm thinking of, these 2 trios, are necessarily the quote unquote best of Jasper's drawings or the favorite, but that they came together to tell a story. That in the room with the catenaries, you have a drawing that's kind of like a shroud, and another that's like a cross, and another that's like maybe a funereal monument. And that those 3 drawings kind of, in a way, wanted to be together to create a certain mood or emotional sensibility. In the next gallery, you have 3 small drawings of the figure from Regrets, quite beautiful ink on plastic, a character from Henri Monnier that's almost lost in this unknowable darkness, and a print that has a heart shape kind of turned on its side, this sense of kind of maybe heartbreak or loneliness. And it was not that any one of those necessarily was calling out to be included in this show of all the many hundreds of drawings that exist, but that they kind of created a constellation that expressed something that we felt deeply across this whole period of Jasper's work. And they, in that sense, as a group, suggested themselves to be seen.
I found, or have always found with his work, that there are certain, regardless of the subject matter or the nominal subject matter, because he's so often taking an identifiable thing and working with it as his subject matter through a graphic manipulation. Regardless of the subject matter, there's an emotional mood that he establishes. And there are different emotions. And I wonder if you became, in working so intimately with his entire output, you became conscious of a set of emotions that you would associate with him, or even somehow got to know the personality through the work, as opposed to the way I think we've all also learned about it through the kind of comment that you just referred to, where he says, well, you didn't ask. It's like asking, why did you represent this object? Well, it was there, is the answer. So on the emotional level, which is, perhaps something that is not the first thing that people think of with Jasper Johns, how did the work, when you became more and more intimate with it, how did it strike you?
Scott, do you want to go first?
Okay, I'll go first on this one because it was something we talked a lot about, and certainly, I think the emotional range of Jasper's work is so powerful and profound, and has maybe been somewhat underestimated in the kind of critical reception of it by and large, or the way that the work gets boiled down to certain operations and procedures and ideas. And I think sometimes that's because if you take, let's say, the work of the 1980s or 90s, if you sort it according to the motifs that Jasper used, like the Picasso portrait with the eyes that he extrapolated, or the quotes from the Eisenheim altarpiece, you end up going down a kind of rabbit hole of, iconography, where you kind of think that the work might reveal its mystery if you could identify all of its sources or its motifs. And that's an interesting way to look at it. But if you maybe sort it instead, as we did, between, let's say, the Dreams and the Nightmares galleries at the Whitney and at Philadelphia, according to the sort of feeling or the sensibility or the emotion of the work. So you're not now putting all the Grunewald works over here and all the Green Angel works over there. You're saying he was exploring different ranges of emotion, sometimes concurrently, and you kind of don't see that as strongly when you take a core sample that's based on motif rather than on what are 5 different motifs from this period that each kind of could point you in a certain way. We also have that, I think, in the Elegies Gallery. If you saw the last show or the penultimate show at Matthew Mark's gallery, where he introduced the Farleys and some of the Picasso more recent works, they were all kind of sorted by motif. And what we did a little bit was to unsort those motifs and resort according to that feeling, that temperature in the work, and hopefully to make that more easy to experience in your gut when you walk in the room, even if you didn't read something or even know what he was quoting within the picture.
And Richard, there is a connection in Jasper between the way in which he lives his life and the way he works and the work itself, right? And I think Barbara Rose pointed at that very early on in a couple of wonderful articles that she wrote on the work for Artforum. And you can really feel it. It's very present. So there's a certain, I will say not only that there's an ethics about, the way in which he goes about his work, but it's truly, those ethics, include an aesthetic position.
There are a couple of things related to what you've both been saying. One is that you did have some combinations of imagery which definitely set a mood. Although I'm not sure, I can name the emotion, but I did notice in going through the groupings that you created that there were certain emotional consistencies, and regardless of the fact that the subjects might be diverse. And with some of the smaller works, what was happening when I looked at them, moving through the gallery spaces, if I was too far away from them to immediately recognize the subject matter, I still felt that I recognized something like an emotion coming from the work, from the configuration of forms. And I was then sometimes surprised at what the subject matter was. So, you know, as one example, he's often using the optical illusion or the puzzle of the old woman and the young woman, you know, where you see it either one way or another way. And at times it looks joyous, and at other times it looks sad, and it's the same image. The same with the green angel. It sometimes is elating, and at other times you feel a little bit depressed in looking at that configuration. But the other thing that I would ask you about is, you know, something which has always struck me. It's especially in Jasper's interviews and the way he responds to questions, is and it has something to do with the way he makes a mark as well, I think. The way that he's self-effacing and doesn't want to, in the end, wants to attribute whatever the effect is to the work itself and not to his having put the effect into the work.
Yes, I think that, you know, it's interesting because very early on there is this fascination with the visual ambiguity, you know, as you said, in those images that can be seen from, you know, representing one thing or the other. And, you know, they appear, you know, very repeatedly in the work. But I think that the correlate of that is that there's a conceptual ambiguity and even an emotional ambiguity, you know, so there's those three layers consistent: the visual ambiguity, the emotional ambiguity, the conceptual ambiguity. And that means that things can be seen, you know, from one way or the other, depending on the viewer. I think he's always been very faithful to the statement that Marcel Duchamp made about the viewer completing the artwork. You know, he's profoundly a Duchampian, and that's an evidence of that.
You know, Richard, one of the places that I've kind of come to think about this, I keep talking about emotion, but I'm saying with this theme that you've introduced, the kind of expressivity in the work is to kind of think so much about it in relation to the things that he was looking at, and then what he was kind of choosing to do or to not do. You know, the opening gallery at the Whitney, which Carlos and I really debated a lot about and thought deeply on this idea that here's an artist who in certain places said, look, de Kooning did very well what he was doing. He didn't need any help from me. And that he didn't want to make the work about his own feelings. So he would maybe turn to things the mind already knows or resist a kind of ostensible, you know, soul bearing. But then through that resistance ends up in a whole other place of hiding or disappearing or negating that itself is very powerful in terms of its emotional resonance. When I look at the ale cans, you know, sometimes they seem funny to me and sometimes they seem absolutely heartbreaking, that this is the position that the artist finds himself in the early 1960s, trying to kind of like navigate his way amidst all of this consumer culture. And like, what would the option be but to make a kind of painstaking replica of this thing that is basically disposable? And in a way, how, I don't want to say that that's a sad thing to do, but there's something like, you know, funny, but also, yeah, a little painful to think of the artist and practicing this mimesis, but also touching and tender and kind of like taking recourse to an old-fashioned idea of what art could be as this mimic of the world. And so a lot of times, I mean, to talk about this as an emotional work is kind of weird because it's not really what we were starting off when we were talking about death or life or, you know, aging. But I've been just struck looking at certain things, kind of trying to think my head into the space that an artist would get into to make a work like this, both in their own life and in the kind of context around them. And I think that is something that has been kind of growing in my mind the more time I spent in this show.
Yeah, perhaps what Jasper is conscious of is how much our culture has lost its old prevailing mythologies, and that can be freeing, liberating, but it can also be sad. And you know, to hear you talk about the ale cans, you know, it's, the sadness is there. I agree. It's potentially there. It's not a little game that's being played, although it can be seen that way also. as a commentary on what other artists are doing. I've always thought of the paradox of Johns's mark making and his methods for making fine art. They're being so obvious and dumb. I mean, as you know, he sometimes says, well, anybody could do this. If you get to praise him too much, he becomes self-demeaning. And yet, people look at these works and they regard them as the works of a master with fantastic technical skills. So when you were immersed in Johns, I mean, how did you feel about things like the touch or the color sense or the sense of scale, those things?
I'll jump in on this one. I think the touch question in the early work is so fascinating because I actually think you're right, Richard, that over the course of like history and the machinations of people like Carlos and me, the curators, and to some degree the market, we've come to see certain early works as extremely virtuosic, when in fact, there's something kind of noodling or even like nebbish in Jasper's early lines. This kind of, he's not Gorky. He's not nailing that perfect serpentine contour in a drawing or like de Kooning with that confidence. There's a feeling of, you know, repetitive kind of noodling around on the surface. And it's kind of amazing when you kind of think back on that, or like filling in, you know, scribbling in. It's sort of like we take early Twombly now as like, oh, what a master mark maker he was. But actually, it's like almost that Jasper was able to create something that was so fascinating and magnificent through a slight, like, or very, I don't want to say a paucity of technical means, because he had a certain facility, but it's kind of good to remind oneself every now and then that these kind of wonderful works are maybe the result of trying to negotiate a way of handling that doesn't necessarily like exude, you know, whatever we might have thought of as, you know, talent or finesse at the level of the mark. And it's been spending time looking at the early work and, you know, what the acoustic allows for in that sense is so incredible. It's like the kind of perfect marriage of a medium and a touch and a image that he's trying to conjure that lets the work be so much more maybe than the manual facility or dexterity behind it.
Yeah, you know, I think that he invents his own virtuosity, Richard, you know, and he doesn't coincide or start from the, you know, the idea of what virtuosity is in the fine arts. You know, he seems to have a very, he's a modern in the sense that he starts from the tabula rasa, you know, but and in that sense, I think he resembles Cézanne very much. You know, you look at Cézanne's Monts Saint Victoires and, you know, they are simply breathtaking, and you don't have any other word than virtuosity in the tip of your tongue, but, you know, they are painfully constructed pictures. And many of Jasper's are painfully constructed and laboriously built pictures, you know, and certainly through that process he finds something, and there's a shared joy, you know, you know, that is very contagious, and that's what we call virtuosity. But it's the joy that is found in the pictures in his own process of discovery.
Yeah, and you know, I would, Richard, to your point about the large and small gestures, or I think you asked something about the scale in your initial question. You know, often for me, the most satisfying of his works are the small and medium-sized ones. And I think it has to do with the relationship of that touch or that mark to the sort of scale of the image or the picture that he's traversing. And we interestingly left out quite a few of the biggest paintings. And there would have been probably a way to start to reverse engineer a checklist where you're like, oh, what are the most impressive things, like Eddingsville from the Stedelijk collection, or, Diver that the Bremans have. And we didn't intend to focus more on medium and sort of smaller and mid-sized things. But I do think that there's something about the relationship of the scale of the mark to the size of the object that's really quite alive, especially in the early years in some of the mid-sized works. And sometimes the bigger ones, there's a sense of almost the scale of the work potentially escaping him, or even in something like According to What, which is so agglomerative as a composition that it has to be to control that much of the field, a kind of compendium of many different, almost discrete ideas.
Yeah, he's such an additive composer, and so when he works large, he's taking, even when he works mid-size or sometimes small, he's combining things. So I think that's how he manages to preserve his own sense of construction in something that's very large. And yeah, he doesn't seem to be an artist who wants to keep going larger and larger and larger. And I think you both had a sufficient number of the large works for the audience to get a good sense of it.
I would almost use the word decomposer rather than composer, because it's really, there's never an accumulation. It's almost like by adding, he subtracts, and that sort of paradoxical nature of the way in which the objects are made is so attractive, and that constitutes its enigmatic quality as well.
Yeah. I thinking of size, you do have a rather large sculptural piece, the silver, or I guess they're aluminum, the numbers that were on the wall of the big naturally lit gallery in New York. And
that's aluminum.
It's aluminum, yeah. Was that just thinking of curatorial choices and getting back to that for a moment, because the Whitney has that room, which is unusual, was that something that seemed to be made for sculpture?
It's always a space we struggle with, because of course that space, the whole floor of the Whitney has no walls or columns, and it's 18,000 square feet. So you could say the whole place was made for sculpture. But when you build a vestibule or a gallery on the west side, you're always kind of contending with the windows, which we often cover for some shows, in fact, because the light is so severe. And so this was a group of works that made sense to kind of, the space suggested the works almost, rather than the other way around, which is how we designed almost the rest of the show. The work suggested the space. And at the Whitney, we have a few extra galleries because we had more space that don't have a pair to them in Philadelphia. And so that was one of them, where we were able to explore the recent sculpture in a space where it could show so beautifully in the natural light. So it was a bit of the window kind of giving us the idea of what to show there.
Yeah, here's another thing that is always on my mind with Johns. It's the works and of where he combines oil and encaustic. One of the biggest ones is in Philadelphia, the Untitled 1972, which I think we have an image of. And I wonder, you may well have mentioned this in the catalog, but I haven't had a chance to read through the whole thing. But did this aspect of Jones's work weigh on curatorial choices, that aspect of his thinking where he would work in 2 or 3 media. In some cases, it's 3 on the same surface or the same construction.
I think that what he ultimately gets to is that it's really difficult to say how these objects are made, and even harder to attribute them to any specific media, because he's definitely, by this time, 1972, he's usually, he's thinking as a printer when he makes paintings, right? And you have the casts, the body casts there, and Jennifer Roberts wrote a beautiful essay talking about printing in relationship to casting and their echoes. So I think that what you have throughout the show is, again, and this is a very postmodern, as much as I said that his approach to, to virtuosity is modern, it is his approach to medium specificity is, if you wish, very postmodern. He definitely does not, respect the boundaries between medium. He's constantly challenging them, and that makes it so that the medium that traditionally in the fine art hierarchy are considered lesser in his work are really majorly important. This painting is no exception to that. But the logic that Scott and I applied when selecting it was that there are major paintings that he has done throughout his career that have functioned as some sort of encyclopedic, either gatherings of earlier work or point of departure for new work. And the room that includes this work in Philadelphia corresponds or is a correlate of a room including according to what the Whitney. So that was where we came from when selecting that.
Right. Yeah.
Richard, one thing your question makes me also think about is that you're talking about a work that might include encaustic and oil, but it's kind of amazing to think that he's a pretty rare artist who has made concurrent bodies of paintings over, let's say, 60 plus years in 2 different painterly mediums. You don't get the sense that most artists, before they start making a painting at any one point in their career, are like, is this one going to be in oil and is this one going to be in acrylic? Maybe they have periods where they're more or less exploring one medium over the other, but almost from the beginning, and you feel that in the flag and maps room at the Whitney, where you see the MoMA map next to which is oil, the encaustic flag on the orange ground. You see pairs of paintings like the 2 versions of Racing Thoughts or of Mirror's Edge, one in encaustic, one in oil in both cases. And the idea that he almost has to think before he starts each one, well, today's an encaustic day or this is an oil work, is kind of fascinating. I don't know that anyone's ever actually done a study of that and those differences side by side over all those years. But and I'd be curious if others on this call can think of many examples of artists who work primarily as painters, switching between their primary painterly medium, kind of alternating at the same time within a body of work. It's kind of an interesting thing to consider that your question makes me want to think about more.
One thing that surprised me in New York, and I don't know if it was true in Philadelphia also, it may have been, but there were a couple of acrylic paintings in New York from the past decade. And Jasper has always said that he doesn't like acrylic, although there are occasional acrylic paintings. But there they were, and they looked fine. Carlos, what in Philadelphia, were there any examples of acrylic?
Carlos, you're on mute.
Unmute.
Sorry, I said that there is an image in the PowerPoint where in our mirror room where you can actually see one acrylic versus encaustic side by side. It's the same image rendered in both media.
Oh, was it a
Green Angel? It's a Green Angel.
Green Angel.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So he did occasionally experiment that way as well. Yeah. And then of course with printmaking, he's all over the place and works on paper every conceivable thing, every conceivable surface using the plastic also. That's another thing, like a medium that he invented, ink on plastic, with all of its own characteristics.
Yes, I think it's in the next slide. You can see. No, next. Sorry. One more. Yes, there you go.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great juxtaposition. And I was also struck that how different the black and white. He's so rarely truly black and white. There's usually a little color that gets in there, but the black and white version of Green Angel seems to have a completely different mood to it. Did he?
That's not as well known of one. That's the one from the Broad collection, which is kind of grisaille with sand in the surface.
It was wonderful to see that.
We hung it next to Montez Singh's, which also has sand in the surface in the acoustic version. And there's an oil version of Montez Singh's. Carlos, I think that these two Green Angels, one is oil and one is encaustic, actually, not acrylic. But that gray version has such a different mood, and that's sort of why it ended up in that Dreams gallery, the kind of pale and fainter palette that we were exploring across those pictures.
I think we have a slide of that gallery, actually, if Nick can find it. And it also has the blue painting that is in Jasper's collection. But if it doesn't come up, that's okay. But that's another thing. Yes, the connections that can be made, the use of the sand, the quality of the surface, so much experimenting being done. When you were going through all the work, I mean, what kinds of things struck you as, well, I've never seen that before? Somebody doing that. I mean, were there any, just bizarre finds that you had?
I mean, there were so many that, but not, maybe the thought wasn't, I've never seen anybody do that, but wow, Jasper did this. It was this sense of, really weird and potentially even embarrassing things. Like if you look in the South Carolina gallery at the Whitney, there's
absolutely
a very strange family portrait, of his grandparents' family that he used in a much more tasteful way in the prints, in a sepia toned image that looked like an old photograph. And suddenly there's this like blown up, weird, almost minty blue and green picture of his family. Or in our mirror gallery, we have a kind of mirrored, like Rorschach tracing of a de Kooning figure. I mean, things that are goofy even and kind of free. There's a Tondo in that Dreams gallery on the opposite wall of the paintings that feel like, wow, he let himself make this thing and put it in the world. That doesn't feel tasteful. It doesn't feel like a Jasper Johns maybe, or like something that people would, equally, admire in some way, that the work was like elegant or chic. And I love that he's not embarrassed, that he's trying these kind of marks, that he's pushing beyond maybe a comfort zone of taste in a way that I think is really powerful.
I think that what Scott is saying, it basically can be summarized by saying that, we by looking very carefully at the work, we found that many of the things that we were looking at were evidence of a different Jasper Johns than the one that has been somewhat constructed or cemented by decades of literature. And that was interesting to us to see, what that consists of, what is it that, doesn't really correspond to that, somewhat preconceived image that, might have been floating out there about what his work was.
That I was struck also by that South Carolina image, and and then because the photographic version, or his trompe-l'oeil photographic version, was in the same room, going back to his rendering of that same photograph by itself, it looked more and more like a Jasper Johns, because it was flat in his strange kind of way. It seemed to feature the way that he made it and not the way the camera saw it. And he has that, I think he has that capacity to transform things in that way, to convert the effect of one medium into the effect of another medium. You know, I think in general, your exhibition, it reveals that. So it's a wonderful thing, and maybe it gets revealed because you've combined all of the media in the display. So the fluidity that the artist has is within the curatorial arrangement itself.
Yeah, I think that's something we really thought a lot about, and Richard, and tried to make a hallmark of the show from the very beginning, that there was going to be this non-hierarchical relationship between, you know, paintings and works on paper, but also amongst motifs, amongst different sizes, amongst the kind of known and the unknown, that the whole approach was meant to be, like you said, extremely fluid. And you're kind of, which is truer, you're immersed in this stream of Jasper's production, of his art, of his career, of his life, which is how it came out of him. You know, it wasn't edited or boiled down into the, oh, masterpieces over there and study things over there, and these are going to be in the history book. He's making all of these things at once and kind of simultaneously in relation to one another. And we wanted to capture that, you know, protean turn of mind in relation to all these different, you know, works of art.
You know, it's interesting because Scott and I visited him a couple of weeks ago, and we had a lovely time with him. And in conversation, we were saying, well, you know, Jasper, you know, if anything, it seems that the show has managed to give like a, you know, more comprehensive view of your work. And he said, well, of course, because there's more of my work being shown. So at some level, that's very, very clear. And Scott and I, you know, when we started looking at all these, you know, working proofs and the enormous variety of drawings and so forth, it was clear to us that, you know, we needed to be able that we needed enough space so we could show that, you know. And certainly, you know, that was one of the reasons, you know, different context to show it. Two museums have very different contexts. The capacity to show that variety of works, as well as the works that are, you know, better recognized. Those were all things that drove our thinking.
Yeah, I guess there are not that many artists who really demand as much space as you've given him to get something like a comprehensive view. And there's certainly still more things I'm sure you probably wanted to include for which there wasn't enough space.
Surely.
I wonder if do you have any cases in mind where something was considered and with regret, a word he uses, you had to eliminate it?
I mean, for my case, I don't have any regrets for sure, you know, but there are works that, you know, we acknowledge are important works that we were not able to include in the show. You know, I mean, the Museum Philadelphia owns a beautiful, the beautiful drawing of Boys 2, you know, which is a promise gift from Keith and Kathy Sachs. And, you know, that really didn't fit within the parameters that we were describing. And Scott referred earlier to the wonderful diver that the Braymans have. And so there were cases, and we try to be careful about, not those cases not to multiply too widely, but there were cases in which there were wonderful works that, were not, didn't really seem to resonate strongly enough with the choices that we were making.
In a few cases at the Whitney, those works even made it to the floor. It pains me to think of the small silver flag that ordinarily hangs in Jasper's dining room that I was desperate to show, and in the end decided it just didn't quite work in that room of flags and maps, or the little green target drawing also from his collection that made the final cut, and just not the final cut, and not for any lack of merit on the part of the work, just a sense of how we wanted to space things. But yeah, there's so many great things that all the way from the spectrum of things we didn't ask for to things that we not only asked for, but that arrived at the museum and didn't quite make it in.
Yeah, you did have the miniature red, yellow, and blue target, I believe.
Yeah, there is one in the that room of kind of miniatures, the small works.
Yeah.
This is the one in Philadelphia, which is bigger, and then we have the kind of baby version at the Whitney.
Yeah.
But that was a tough one because that room, to my mind, we could have put one more small thing in it, but it felt like it needed to have space between the works or the groupings, that they were like kind of icebergs in a sea, and that space would help you see the sense of scale that they had that I was trying to animate.
So what would be your final thoughts about the connection of his personality to his work?
Do you want to go first, Carlos? Or no?
I think that, Richard, that was what I was referring to when I spoke about Barbara Rose. I think that there's a certain ethics, in the way in which he conducts himself, what, the deep respect for the viewer, that is, just in everything that he says, in everything that he does, and it's completely deeply reflected in the work.
And I think I feel a lot, Richard, is about his personality, or his life in relation to the work, is just the incredible sense of devotion to the work, the kind of care, the craft, the hard work of it, the attention, and to some degree maybe the shutting out of other things in life or in the world in order to make this remarkable body of work. It's almost overwhelming sometimes as I go through the show, also knowing that I'm only looking at half of it and the other half is sitting there at the exact same time in Philadelphia. An artist who gave so much to his work and in turn gives so much to us is really a very beautiful thought.
So I think you both hit on what we started off with, that remark that he made. Many have the odd sensation of being called upon to do it. And, it's that devotion to the work, or that focus that he has, which is part of his personality, and it's in the work as well. I'm referring to a kind of final commentary, because we've gone on for about an hour, and we want to leave some time for Q&A, which I think Nick is controlling. And then we also have some poetry.
Yeah, no, I want to thank you so much, Richard and Scott and Carlos, for this wonderful conversation. We have lots of questions from the audience. We'll do our best to take a few. I know, Scott, that you have to leave very shortly, but we're going to reverse what our typical tradition is, and the Rails' own Phong H. Bowie is going to ask our first question.
Okay, so I can stay a little longer, Nick, to do some of the questions, and then if I can't,
right.
Carlos will know all the answers without me, so I apologize.
Thanks. Thank you for the wonderful conversation, Scott. Thank you, Richard. Thank you, Carlos. I wanted to extend the question because Richard and I was talking the other day, and for some reason we talk about John Dewey, partly salute, Scott, partly because I'm reading Richard Rorty right now, rereading Philosophy and Mirror Nature. Since the show coinciding, it's called Mind and Mirror. So it's interesting to kind of looking at Richard Rorty idea of neo-pragmatism and realizing that John Dewey, who was born in 1859, I think it's the same year that Original Species were published, and he lived a long life until 1951, I think, so he was 92, very much lived a long life, gone through the Civil War, the First War, Second War, and whatnot. And so has Jasper, I'm thinking now, because he's 91, and he also have gone through a lot. Born 1930, so Great Depression, the First War, Second War, the war in Vietnam and Iraq War and whatnot. It's a lot. He's also gone through a lot. And thinking about Rorty, talking about John Dewey, it's sort of the synthesis, at least he's tried to appeal to the idea of naturalism, because we know that was Darwin, and historicism of Hegelian thinking. And I'm thinking the same way with Jasper too, because real thing as art, real things, as you mentioned in the show in Philadelphia, with be it the target, the flag, and other object. So that's one way of injecting that idea to share, but there's also way to use object as real thing in order to hide, to disappear, to not be in there in front and center. And I was very compelled to your remark earlier, Scott, why he would never bother making painting or try to, manifest his dexterity of touch, like the Kunin you mentioned, which brings to mind the whole idea of his love and admiration for Cézanne. It's a good example, am I right? Where Cézanne himself had once thought about whether he would be like Delacroix, the romantic idea of a painter, but soon he had to get rid of it in order to amplify what Richard's talking about earlier, the idea of additive, being an additive painter. And that's what Cézanne did. He observed real thing in order to amplify that additive nature. So where my question is, where does Jasper relate, if at all, to Dewey? Number one question. The second question is Cézanne. Does that make sense, Scott? Carlos?
Yes, he's somewhat a pragmatist. In that sense, we know that he's, he was a reader of Wittgenstein and Mr. Schwartz. Yes, absolutely. He definitely was. But the relationship, but I think that he's, in my experience, he's more of a reader of poetry and literature than a reader of philosophy. But definitely there is a kind of like a philosophical pragmatist background there, very present. So I would agree with you absolutely on that. And the parallel with Cézanne, absolutely, absolutely. I think that there is a recent and very beautiful essay that DJ Clark wrote on Pizarro and Cézanne, where basically says, Pizarro was so gifted in so many ways, and Cézanne was not gifted, but he made out of those lacks, he built modernity, right? And you see Jasper building out, something that goes beyond modernity out of his own lack. Yeah.
Right. Okay, Scott, what do you think of? Are you in agreement with Carlos' observation there?
Yes, and I'm just afraid I don't feel expert enough in Dewey or Hegel to comment too much on that observation, but I do think that Carlos, how you put it makes sense to me. And it was interesting to have the Cézanne drawing show. I've seen several comments about Cézanne in the chat, including the most recent one. up at the same time. And there were so many different, not only was it up, not at the same time, but kind of almost at the same time, just before. And so many of the works that Jasper lent to that show, you know, he was one of the larger lenders, I think, from private collections. And of course, there were certain ideas about the making of a picture that resonated in that sense of a certain kind of mark, and using maybe similar kinds of marks to articulate different kinds of subjects or spaces. But that's, you know, to do with the nature of the picture, but also that sense of that attention and that daily practice and that care and that focus, that maybe is what I was trying to end with before, does tie back into Cezanne and Jasper's love of him in my mind.
Yeah, and I was thinking about how Louis, it's this very simple idea of democratic learning through doing, through making, the whole act of making, and there's no artificial necessity to divine academic learning and vocational study. And that's what I was alluding to with Richard. I think, in other words, as much as one can identify the target as real thing in life, or the map, and, you know, the beer can and so on, that is the part that he feel direct link to, you know, the broader context of democratic appeal or viewership or whatnot. But I just felt this is something else going on here with the opposite, which is a certain idea of democratic, you know, aspiration. I mean, Richard, I mean, we were talking about this. Can you sort of share a little bit of your meditation on the matter?
Well, one thing that I would emphasize, which I think, you know, connects Jasper Johns to John Dewey, is Dewey's idea that any making process is an art process. So, you know, in Jasper's case, I mean, he gets interested in the alley-oop comic strip, for example, which readers at the time would see every day, and he sees something in it and makes something out of it. And the lowliness of the source does not prevent the work from being profound, as any act of making can be. And that's very democratic. And so, I mean, Dewey would not make a difference between the making processes that are associated with different strata of society or different classes of people. It's all aestheticized. It's all art. Fundamentally, it's all a contribution. I have one little factual thing that others may be aware of. Aside from Jasper's having all those Cezanne drawings and some Cezanne paintings as well, he has the smallest painting that Cezanne ever made. And it is truly a miniature. And I think it is the only Cezanne of its type. And it's very strange. And I have no idea why Cezanne made it, but there it is. And Jasper found out about it and he acquired it.
Right. That's interesting. Well, we were looking at the early Cezanne self-portrait that Jasper lent to the drawing show at MoMA, Scott, that you sort of mentioned just now. So there, David Reed and I and Guy Goodwin were looking at the last day, and we have hard time identifying which one is real. We were disputing about, you know, which one is real Cezanne or which is a copy, or was it both that he copied, you know, decidedly so. Anyway, thank you so much. I will leave other to ask their questions because I can ask other, but I'm gonna choose not to. Thank you. Back, Nikki.
And I return. Thank you so much, Fong, and thank you, Richard, Carlos, and Scott, for your wonderful responses. We're going to keep moving along, and I am next going to pass the mic to Rail Art Scene Editor, Amanda Gluibitsi. Amanda, you should be able to turn your mic on now.
Great, thank you, Nick. I'll turn on my video too, so you can see me. Hello, thank you so much for this wonderful conversation and also for the show. I was so excited to see it. One thing that I've always found really, really tricky about Johns is that he's so silent, an artist, but is also using what seems to be a personal iconography or sometimes even literally ciphers in his work. So for example, the numbers paintings, those are like a base level of code, right? They're a Caesar cipher before they've been attached to letters, or cross-hatching, which is traditionally used either to reveal a form or to conceal a form, or painting bitten by a man, which is my favorite Johns, where he takes a bite out of his own painting, but then all he has in his mouth is art. And so the art and the man seem to be coextensive. They seem almost to cancel each other out. And so my question is then, how do we grapple with this silence, and how do we avoid the trap of over-interpreting?
My feeling is that he hasn't been totally silent, or maybe all that silent. I guess it depends on what we expect the artist to say in speaking about their work. It's like he's answered quite a lot of interviews where he'll talk quite openly about maybe how he made something more than why he made something, or what it is rather than what it means. And so I don't know if it's a trap of over-interpreting unless we imagine that there is a kind of fixed answer that exists either in like the world or in Jasper's head. And if not, it's kind of like a body of work that invites so much interpreting, and it's hard to know when, because if you said, well, but was that what the artist was thinking or trying to do? He's kind of never going to tell you anyway. And so I don't know. I think that's part of what he wants. I found that as a curator in this show, because we did such an interpretive exhibition to the extent that we created these categories. We arranged works according to concepts that were not necessarily given in the work. Some were like, oh, here's a show that we recreated from 1968, or here's a bunch of flags and maps, but others that were very authorial and maybe, are not how he thought of his work, certainly not how he made it or presented it exactly, but it's a body of work to me that feels like it invites that in ways that are quite interesting. And it was sort of wonderful. I mean, I've worked with artists like Jeff Koons, who have said everything that they believe that their work is about. And then it's almost hard to like get a word into that conversation. Or if you do, you feel like your interpretation is potentially at odds with the artist. And there was something quite liberating about that trap. I guess I didn't find it a trap. I found it a wellspring of possibility.
What's interesting to me about that answer is that you actually also just answered Fong's question about Dewey. Because of course, if Johns is concerned about how to make rather than why to make, then that is a Deweyan and pragmatic proposition.
I feel that, the work is kaleidoscopic, but it's like a kaleidoscope in which you keep adding forms and colors, and so originally the form and the color had a specific context, but then it changed as it rotated with time, and it acquired a different form and a different context, and that keeps happening and happening. And going through the exhibition is almost like being inside this kaleidoscope. And I feel that we have a tendency to try to stabilize the signs, and in Johns that the signs are never stable, that produces a lot of anxiety. We tend to respond orally to that. But I think that his reticence, because he's not really silenced, in the way that he, as Scott says, has spoken quite a bit, but his reticence is really to create in that space, to create in a space in which the sign can dance.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think with regard to over-interpretation, any interpretation that leaves an opening for other interpretations is probably okay with Jasper Johns.
Thank you all, and thank you, Amanda, for that question. Next, I'm going to pass the mic over to Sid. Sid, you should see prompt to turn on your mic now. There you are.
Oy vey. Okay, I have a couple questions. Since you had direct the works in front of you, how much encoded information did you see, like covered over with encaustic in the newspaper prints? I know at Matthews Marks, when he had the bronze show a few years ago, there was newspaper plates pushed into the wax before it was cast, and it was specific newspaper clippings, so they mean something. So how much, you're all talking about acrylic and oil and encaustic and how things are made. I mean, that's how the materials are made, and that's the formalist problem. That Leo Steinberg, he wrote other criteria because of Johns. I want to know about the content, the other criteria. I want to know what the meanings that you've discovered in this show. It's a major show. What did you discover? I mean, I think they're meant to be read in a certain way.
I think, see, that the meaning is a profound interrogation of meaning. I think that there's certainly layers and layers and layers, and you can locate those layers, and you can locate them very precisely. Not only physically in terms of the canvas, but historically and biographically. And then those layers are repeated again, and they change location, and they keep changing location. And so what you look at is, is a little bit that why they keep changing location. What is the overall strategy that determines the movement of meaning and the fluidity of meaning in the work? That's what the shows try to do. That's what we did, And that, I think, leaves a lot of space for other people to look at other things as well. We said that for us, Jasper is a little bit like a mountain, and we just explore a side of the mountain, and try to trace its contour. But, that's where we stop.
I think for an artist like Jasper, for lots of other artists, the choice of materials is itself already a meaning through its connotations, and the connotations that derive from the way something is constructed or the elements that are part of the construction. And so when you have text in on the surface, which is often the case with Johns, that is I think Carlos said the same thing, that it is a mode of communication, which is interacting with other modes of communication together, which is very much the way we perceive the world. So when I listen to what somebody is saying, I'm also observing how they look when they're saying it. And I'm observing I'm hearing the pitch of the voice and the rhythm of the speech, and all of these things, though I may not be able to analyze them very well, are contributing to the meaning. And that element of perception, I think, is always something that has fascinated Jasper within his own life, as he keeps reflecting on what something actually means beyond what it first seems to mean, as when he turns something upside down. Is it just the thing upside down, or is it now something completely different?
Can I just interject one thing? And then, when he first used encaustic, wasn't it an expediency because the paintings weren't drying fast enough? So he found this material that dried immediately. That's not meaning. That's what an artist does. Oh. That's what a painter does. He discovered it.
Sure. Well, they're practical matters, and they're matters of signification. But even the practical matters signify, because part of a choice.
Yeah, what Richard said is, there's text on the surface, there's text below the surface, and there's text above the surface, which is part of our own conversation. And he has a structure of the work in which all of that is somewhat played out and made clear. Those processes, those textual interactions are made clear. And that's for us to think about and enjoy.
Thank you all. Next, I'm going to pass the mic to our friend G.E. Schwartz. G.E.
Thank you so much. The show was phenomenal and a lifetime worth of wonder. Visiting the show last month, and I was seeing all the sensible words in the language we were talking about, And I was drawing connections to obviously Ludwig Wittgenstein and Samuel Beckett. I do think that, you know, we're to circle back to the Wittgenstein thing, was very much more, I think he read Wittgenstein more as a poet or a maker of poems than he did even the philosophy. And I was wondering, is he revealing, and I'm not looking for meaning here, but is he revealing a similar inquiry into the inadequacy of language to represent its subject, those very gaps between our common language and subjective meaning, in perhaps the same way that those writers did?
I would agree with that, Jay. Absolutely, yes. I think that he's done that from the beginning. You know, for the news, one of the paintings in Philadelphia is a rebus, right? 4 panels, the letter, you know, the word there repeated twice, and a newspaper in a slot.
Thank you.
Thank you, GE, and thank you, Carlos. I'm going to pass the mic now to Hovey Brock. Hovey, you should be able to turn on your microphone now.
Yes, hi. Let me turn my video on. I was curious about the relationship between Johns and Munch. Between the Clock and the Bed from 1989 is a specific call out to Munch, but was there anything prior to that where you know, Johns was sort of channeling Munch? Or I'm just asking because initially John seemed such a deadpan painter, and then, you know, he starts engaging with this, you know, the man who invented Expressionism. So I'm wondering what the relationship is there.
You know, I didn't see that show. I mean, it's a pity that Scott is not here, because he would have been a better, you know, he would have been more eloquent than I can be. But
the references to the Munch, is it the self-portrait? I mean, there are other Munch paintings, Carlos.
Right. That's a self-portrait of Munch, and it's funny because the tablecloth on the table, you know, resembles his crosshatch paintings.
No, I mean, there are other Munch in John's Reserve, other besides Between the Clock and the Bed.
Right.
There are other Munch images that are used. But I can't quite recall which ones are used.
My personal impression is, you know, I was fortunate enough to start to study his sketchbooks, you know, and the sketchbooks don't reveal anything but clarify a lot. And I don't see Munch as a very, you know, strong presence there. I see Picasso and Duchamp, you know, and some contemporary artists as well, you know. So that's all I can say, you know. I mean, there are encounters with a lot, you know, Manet. I mean, he maps those encounters, and he's very explicit about them, you know, in his own work, you know, Pito, Manet, I mean, Munch, you know, but in my experience, the artists that I see that gravitating more strongly in his imagination or coming out more repeatedly in his writings are Duchamp and Picasso.
Okay. I was just curious because, you know, Munch is almost in a way, temperamentally, it would appear a polar opposite.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I agree with Carlos that it's Duchamp and Picasso, but I think Jasper simply appreciated what a spectacular painter Munch was. Mm-hmm. You know, just as he had an appreciation of de Kooning ultimately, and there isn't much else that connects them other than that Johns can see how good other artists are.
Fair enough. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Hovey. And
Nick, I have I'm worried that Scott has had to leave and I have to leave shortly also. And we have some poetry as well.
Yes.
I may have to leave.
Well, I think that
But
is
not
a
for, not for the next 10 minutes, but after that, I have to leave.
I think that is a good moment for us to shift over to poetry. And I want to thank you, Richard, to Carlos, and of course to Scott, who had to head out for this wonderful conversation. And we're thrilled that this will be edited into a feature interview in an upcoming issue of The Rail. And I think it's really wonderful that these two shows at the Whitney and at the Philadelphia Museum invite this slowness in looking. And I think that you've encouraged us to do that today. And we'll be able to enjoy this conversation in another context soon. So I want to thank you again. It is our tradition here at The Rail to close our events with a poetry reading. So I am thrilled to welcome our poet laureate of the day, Cole Swensen, to the stage. Poet Cole Swensen is the author of 17 volumes of poetry and a collection of critical essays, Noise That Stays Noise. A book of hybrid poem essays, Art and Time, was published by Nightboat in 2021. And a former Guggenheim Fellow, she has been a finalist for the National Book Award, among many other awards. Cole leads our Publishing in Transit series here on the NSE. And without further ado, Cole, I'm passing you the mic.
Thank you very much. And thank you for that great discussion and the gorgeous show. And I was very happy to be able to be here today. I'm going to read from a book, Art and Time, that came out recently that is all on artists. And I thought I would read the piece on Wilhelm de Kooning. It seemed like it might be appropriate for this. Composed windows. Field. If there's a woman in a garden, there's a field in shredded color, or a woman in an arc of garden peeling backward. If there's a field, it's only color outward. If the body of the garden were ever hurled open, its howl of color tearing the horizon into hundreds of days. Each day, Wilhelm de Kooning stowed away on a British freighter heading for Argentina, hiding in the engine room for the 12 days it took to cross the Atlantic, and disembarked at Newport News in 1926, his mother having once again violently assaulted him. And it was, he decided, time to become bohemian. Field, a flag of erasure. One life becomes another, apparently greener, apparently putting the field directly in the center. De Kooning wandered the upward farther, working as a house painter and a bit for the WPA. It was summer, pink landscape, 1938. It was morning, and it was going to stay that way. In a re-examination of the nature of territory, de Kooning came to see a different way of reading contour, the possibility of a landscape of the body. In the summer of 1948, he was invited to teach at Black Mountain as a last-minute replacement for a painter who had canceled due to illness. And a good thing it was, said Elaine. They were totally broke with nothing looking hopeful. A photo shows Wilhelm slightly fragile and fierce against a background that would be vividly green if it weren't in black and white against all of rolling North Carolina. Asheville, 1948. Great height as the field backs up, great in its white and climbs, so inhabited from the inside. A body exudes its own landscape. De Kooning no longer worried about the source of the curve, the flight of the line. If there's a line that flies and the following eye, if the eye should follow a line of hills until a figure turns around and is caught as the background, such enormous distance inflicted ignites the sky. Bolton Landing, 1957, the lake stretching impossibly into sight, standing on the shore with David Smith, the light coming back to strike the side of a boathouse or pier behind them, throwing the whole into relief against the brilliant water, creating its own sun, crossing in its pattern. By the late 50s, he was getting increasingly abstract, creating landscapes he referred to as pastoral and parkway. Artists have no pasts, he said, and bless your heart when he meant to say goodbye. At times, de Kooning kept his paintings from drying too quickly by covering them with newspapers, at times leaving a ghost trace of the news shifting across the surface of the picture. At times, de Kooning would paint all day and then scrape the whole thing down at the end, and in the morning begin again with the remains, a new ghost floating difference that will surface later in the eye of the viewer, which is also always historically layered. Returning to Europe for several months in black and white, 1959 to 1960, Villa Borghese, he walked on his hands all across Rome, his hands held on. Also in 1960, he painted Door to the River, this time on his way to and from East Hampton with house painter's brushes, painting the door open. In 1961, he began work on a new studio in Springs, Long Island. A 1962 photo by Hans Namuth shows him standing in an enormous excavated space with a line of trees behind. There are tracks from heavy machinery at his feet, and most of the trees are bare. In just a few weeks, leaves will create a wall of green extending beyond the photo's frame, farther than the eye could see. A few years later, he executed a series of paintings on actual doors purchased for the purpose, which made the works necessarily tall and narrow, the opposite of a landscape's proportions. And though they were, in fact, compositions based on women, we sense in them a landscape deepened by the constraint of the format, which in turn awakens in the center of each work a source of sky. He is said to have kept an unnaturally neat studio, composed largely of windows, including a skylight 40 feet wide, a roof of sheer sight. And though he couldn't see the sea, it wasn't that far away. The North Atlantic Light, 1977, with a child's sailboat at the center of a blue that stutters through a rehearsal of convergent color, making echolocation a medium of figuration. And so on can go the boat into its storm. Thank you. Thanks to the rail, and thanks to all of you for that great conversation.
Thank you so much, Cole. I don't know if you can hear the roar coming from the office, but I want to once again thank you, Cole. Thank you, Richard, Carlos, and Scott for this wonderful conversation today. I'd also like to thank Joanna at the Whitney Museum and Tessa at the Philadelphia Museum, who were integral to helping make this happen today. So thanks to both of them. And we encourage everyone to view our archive of these conversations on YouTube, where we'll upload today's conversation shortly. So we are here every day at 1 p.m., some days at 3 p.m., but join us on Monday at 1 p.m. for a conversation between Radcliffe Bailey and Ksenia M. Soboleva. We'll conclude with a poetry reading from Isabel Sobral. You can now all turn on your microphones to say hello and goodbye, and to wish everyone a lovely weekend. So thank you all for joining today.
Okay, hold on.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you
So much.
Thank you, Richard.
Thank you.
Thank you. Nice to see you.
Thank you, Carlos.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Carlos.
Thank you,
Richard.
Thank you.
Thank you, Scott.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Scott and Absentia.
Conversation.
Hi, Norma. Hi, Mark. Hi, Umberto. Hi, James. We'll see you next week. James.
Thank you, Nick and Rich and
Thank
Cole.
you.
and-
To see you.
Thank you, Richard.
Hi, Donna. See you.
Thank you.
Thank you all for joining. Okay, well, have a wonderful weekend. Be safe. Take care, and congratulations, Richard, Carlos, and
Yeah, sorry for if I shortened our meeting. But,
not at all.
I have to leave. So
No,
thank
Zoom
you
waits
all.
for no- we look forward to the eventual interview. So
Okay,
to be continued.
To be continued.
Thank you, Richard.
bye.
Take care,
Bye.
everyone. Have a great weekend. Bye.